June 1967. The Sinai Desert is a furnace of sand and rock, where the air itself seems to vibrate with the coming of a storm. But this isn't a storm of rain, it is a storm of fire. On one side, the massive Soviet-supplied armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, armed with the pride of the Kremlin, the T-55. It is sleek, low-profile, and theoretically superior in every way. On the other side, the Israeli Defense Forces, fielding an aging, upgraded British veteran, the Centurion. To the world looking on, the math was simple. The Israelis were outnumbered, outgunned, and out-teched. But in the high-stakes poker game of armored warfare, raw stats are a lie. Because on the Golan Heights and in the Sinai Passes, the Israelis were about to prove that a tank's most powerful component isn't its engine or its armor. It's the 3 degrees of depression in its main gun and the cold, calculated training of the men inside. This is the story of the Centurion versus the T-55. This is the story of the Shot, the whip. To understand the Six-Day War, you have to understand the philosophy of the machines. The Soviet T-55 was built for the flat, sweeping plains of Europe. It was designed to be a low-profile target, hard to see and harder to hit. But that sleek design came with a fatal flaw. Its turret was so cramped and low that its 100-millimeter gun could barely point downward. The British Centurion, however, was a tall tank. The Centurion could depress its gun, aiming it down to 10 degrees. The T-55, barely 4. In the rugged, mountainous terrain of the Middle East, those 6 degrees of difference were the difference between life and death. How does a taller, slower tank survive against a swarm of faster, lower-profile enemies? The answer wasn't found in a factory in London or Moscow. It was found in the hull-down position, a tactical masterstroke that turned the desert hills into impenetrable fortresses. June 5th, 1967. The war begins with a lightning airstrike, but the fate of the nation rests on the ground. In the Sinai, the Egyptian army has hundreds of T-54 and T-55 tanks dug into massive defensive complexes like Abu Agela. These are the gates of the Sinai. The Israelis, led by commanders like Ariel Sharon and Israel Tal, knew they couldn't win a head-on slugfest in the open desert. They had to be smarter. They had to be faster. The Israeli Centurions, renamed the Shot, had been upgraded with powerful Continental diesel engines and the legendary British 105mm L7 rifled gun. This gun was a sniper's rifle in a world of shotguns. But even a great gun is useless if you get hit first. This is the tactical high ground. As the Egyptian T-55s rolled through the valleys, the Israeli tankers performed a deadly ballet. They would drive their Centurions up the back of a ridge until only the very top of the gun barrel peeked over the crest. Because of that superior gun depression, the Centurion could fire down into the valley while keeping its entire hull, its body, protected by tons of solid earth and rock. To the Egyptian crews, it was a nightmare. They would look up and see nothing but a flash of fire from the top of a hill. They would try to return fire, but their guns couldn't tilt high enough to hit the ridgeline. Their shells would either bury themselves in the hillside or sail harmlessly into the blue sky. Meanwhile, the Israeli gunners, trained to hit targets at 2,000 yards, while the Egyptians struggled at 800, began a systematic execution. At the Battle of Gerati Pass, the Centurions faced a literal wall of Egyptian armor. The T-55s were packed so tightly that the Israelis didn't even need to lead their targets. They would fire from one position on the ridge, reverse back down out of sight, and then reappear 50 yards to the left. The Egyptians were fighting ghosts. They were aiming at smoke that was already gone. By the second day of the war, hundreds of Soviet-made tanks, many with their engines still running, abandoned by crews who realized they were trapped in a valley of death. But the Sinai was just half the story. To the north, on the Golan Heights, the Syrian army sat in reinforced concrete bunkers, looking down on the Israeli settlements below. They had the numbers, They had the height. They had the T-55s. If the Israelis wanted to survive, they had to do the impossible. They had to attack up the hill. The Israeli Centurions clawed their way up the steep basalt slopes. They used their superior suspension to navigate terrain that would have thrown the tracks of a T-55. When they reached the top, the gun depression advantage reversed. Now, the Israelis were so close and so high that the Syrians couldn't tilt their guns down far enough to hit them as they breached the trenches. The Centurions became beasts of the Golan, crushing bunkers and overrunning positions that had been deemed impregnable. In 6 days, the map of the Middle East was redrawn. The Israeli Armored Corps had destroyed over 800 enemy tanks. The obsolete Centurion had outplayed, outfought, and outlasted the modern T-55.